Long before the great palaces of Persepolis would rise from the earth like dreams made manifest in stone, before the banners of empire would flutter across 3 continents, the Iranian plateau stretched beneath endless skies as a realm of silence and shadow. Here, in this vast expanse of high desert and rolling hills, where the air grew thin and the horizon shimmered with distant mountain peaks, time moved with the unhurried patience of geological ages. The land itself seemed to breathe slowly, its ancient surface marked by the gentle scars of countless seasons, each one adding another layer to the story written in dust and stone. The sun would rise each morning over these windswept territories with the same golden authority it had claimed for millennia, casting long shadows across valleys where wild grasses bent and whispered secrets to the morning breeze. This was a place where echoes carried far, where the cry of a hawk could linger in the air long after the bird had vanished into the crystal clarity of the high-altitude sky. The very earth seemed to hold memory, as if the countless footsteps of generations had somehow impressed themselves into the soil, creating an invisible network of paths and purposes known only to those who called this harsh beauty home. To the northwest, where the Zagros Mountains lifted their snow-crowned heads toward the heavens, the kingdom of Media had taken root like a hardy desert flower that blooms despite the austere conditions. The Median people had learned to read the subtle signs of their environment, understanding the language of clouds that promised rain, recognizing the patterns of seasonal migration that brought both game and opportunity. Their settlements dotted the landscape like scattered stars, each one a small constellation of mud-brick buildings that seemed to emerge organically from the earth itself, as if the desert had dreamed them into existence. The Median cities hummed with the quiet industry of a civilization that had found its rhythm within the constraints of a demanding environment. Craftsmen worked bronze and iron with skills passed down through generations, their hammers ringing out across courtyards where children played games as old as memory. Markets buzzed with the low murmur of negotiation and exchange, where the scents of cardamom and coriander mingled with the earthier aromas of leather and wool. Water was precious here, channeled through ingenious systems of underground channels that carried the life-giving flow from distant mountain streams to thirsty fields where barley and wheat grew in careful rows. The nobility of Media held court in halls where oil lamps flickered against walls, adorned with hunting scenes and geometric patterns that spoke of aesthetic sensibilities refined by centuries of artistic tradition. Their horses were legendary, bred for endurance and speed across terrain that would humble lesser mounts, and their riders moved with the fluid grace of those born to the saddle. These were people who understood the balance between civilization and the wild spaces beyond their walls, who knew that survival depended not on conquering their environment, but on learning to dance with its rhythms. Beyond the established boundaries of Median territory, however, the plateau opened into a different realm entirely. Here, among the rolling steppes and hidden valleys, the nomadic tribes moved like spirits across the landscape, their presence marked more by absence than by any permanent imprint upon the land. These were the wanderers, the followers of ancient paths that existed more in memory and instinct than in any physical marking upon the earth. Their homes were not built of stone and clay, but woven from wool and leather, structures that could be dismantled with the rising sun and rebuilt beneath new stars. The nomadic life required a different kind of wisdom, one that read significance in the movement of clouds, that could predict weather patterns from the behavior of birds, that knew which valleys would provide shelter from the fierce winds that could sweep across the plateau without warning. Their flocks moved like living clouds across the grasslands, sheep and goats and hardy cattle that had adapted to thrive in conditions that would challenge any sedentary farmer. The shepherds who guided these animals possessed an almost mystical understanding of the land's moods and seasons, able to find water where others saw only dry earth, to locate grazing where the inexperienced eye perceived only barren waste. Among these wandering peoples, the bonds of kinship extended like invisible threads across vast distances, connecting scattered groups through networks of marriage and alliance, that could span the entire breadth of the plateau. Stories travelled along these connections, carrying news and wisdom and the accumulated lore of generations across landscapes that might take weeks to traverse. The greatest storytellers were treasured like living libraries, their memories containing the genealogies and great deeds that formed the backbone of tribal identity. The horses of the nomads were more than mere animals. They were partners in the endless dance of movement that defined existence on the steppes. These creatures, descended from wild herds that had roamed these lands since time immemorial, possessed an intelligence and hardiness that made them ideal companions for a life of constant travel. A nomad's relationship with his mount was one of mutual dependence and respect, forged through shared hardships and the intimate understanding that came from spending days and nights under the same vast sky. At night, when the tribes made camp in some sheltered valley or beside a spring that bubbled up from hidden depths, the darkness would come alive with the soft sounds of domestic life conducted under starlight. Children learned the ancient songs that preserved their people's history, their young voices joining the chorus that had echoed across these spaces for countless generations. The women worked at looms that could be quickly folded and packed, creating textiles whose patterns told stories of their own, each design carrying meaning that connected the present moment to the accumulated wisdom of their ancestors. The men gathered around small fires to discuss the movements of game animals, the condition of distant pastures, the subtle signs that might indicate the approach of weather systems that could dramatically alter their plans. These conversations were conducted in low tones that would not carry beyond the circle of firelight, for the nomads understood that the desert had many ears, and information about resources or routes was valuable currency in a world where survival often hung on the thinnest of margins. As winter deepened across the plateau, both the settled Medians and the wandering tribes would prepare for the season of testing that lay ahead. The Medians would retreat behind their walls to wait out the harsh months in relative comfort, their storehouses filled with grain, and their workshops busy with the creation of goods that would be traded when spring returned. The nomads, meanwhile, would begin their slow migration toward winter quarters, moving their herds to sheltered valleys where the animals could survive until the return of green grass and flowing water. In this ancient landscape, where the boundaries between the civilized and the wild remained fluid and permeable, the stage was being set for changes that would reshape the entire known world. The winds that swept across the Iranian plateau carried more than sand and the sense of distant places. They carried the whispers of destiny, the subtle currents of historical force that would soon coalesce around a name not yet spoken, a figure not yet born, whose impact would echo through millennia like thunder rolling endlessly across these timeless spaces. In the fertile valleys of Anshan, where the Zagros Mountains descend toward the Persian Gulf, like ancient guardians keeping watch over the land, a child was born, whose name would echo through the corridors of history for millennia to come. The year was somewhere around 600 BCE, though time itself seems to bend around such momentous births. And the precise moment matters less than the profound currents that were already stirring in the world. Anshan was then a vassal kingdom under the mighty Median Empire, its rulers paying tribute to the great king who held court in Ecbatana. Yet within this seemingly subordinate realm, forces were gathering that would reshape the entire known world. The story of Cyrus begins not with the certainty of historical record, but with the golden threads of legend that the Persian storytellers would weave for generations afterward. According to the tales that survived in the courts of his successors, Cyrus was born to Cambyses I, the king of Anshan, and Mandane, a Median princess, whose marriage had been arranged to strengthen the bonds between the Persian vassals and their Median overlords. This union of bloodlines carried within it all the complexity of the age, the mingling of the settled and the nomadic, the civilized and the tribal, the ruled and the ruling. But legend, as it often does, transforms even the most extraordinary of births into something approaching the mythical. The court historians would later record that Astyages, the king of Media and grandfather to the unborn child, was visited by troubling dreams in which vines grew from his daughter's womb to cover all of Asia, and water flowed from her to flood the entire world. These visions, interpreted by the Median Magi as omens of a grandson who would one day overthrow his grandfather's kingdom, set in motion a chain of events that reads more like ancient myth than historical fact. The dream-haunted Astyages, according to these same Persian chronicles, commanded that the child be killed upon birth. The task was given to Harpagus, a trusted noble of the Median court. Yet when the moment came to carry out this grim order, the nobleman instead entrusted the infant to a shepherd named Mithridates. The shepherd and his wife, who had recently lost their own child, raised the boy as their own in the mountain pastures, where sheep grazed on the sweet grass that grew wild among the ancient stones left by forgotten peoples. The child grew strong among the flocks, learning the ways of the high country, where the wind carried the scent of pine and snow even in summer, where eagles soared on thermals rising from sun-warmed valleys, and where the night sky spread overhead like a vast tapestry sewn with silver thread. In this pastoral setting, far from the intrigues of courts and the weight of royal expectations, Cyrus learned the virtues that would later make him beloved among his subjects: simplicity, justice, and an understanding of the common people that would set him apart from other rulers of his age. Yet the truth, as historians have come to understand it, was likely far more prosaic than these elaborate tales of prophetic dreams and divine intervention. The historical Cyrus was indeed born into the royal house of Anshan, probably around the year 600 BCE, during a period when the Persian tribes were gradually consolidating under the leadership of the Achaemenid dynasty. His grandfather Ctesippus had established Persian rule over Anshan in the previous century, and his father Cambyses had continued the careful work of building alliances and strengthening the kingdom's position within the broader Median sphere of influence. Anshan itself was strategically positioned in what is now the Fars province of Iran, nestled between the Zagros Mountains and the Persian Gulf, controlling important trade routes that connected the Iranian plateau with Mesopotamia and the wider ancient world. The city commanded fertile agricultural land where wheat and barley grew in abundance, while the surrounding hills provided grazing for vast herds of horses, cattle, and sheep. Natural deposits of precious metals and stones added to the region's wealth, making Anshan a prize worth controlling and a base from which ambitious rulers might launch greater ventures. The young Cyrus would have grown to manhood in this environment of careful political calculation and growing Persian self-confidence. The Achaemenid court at Anshan was sophisticated despite its provincial status, maintaining scribes who could write in multiple languages, diplomats who understood the complex relationships between the various peoples of the Iranian plateau, and military commanders who had studied the tactics that had made Media the dominant power in the region. Persian noble children received education in what Herodotus would later call the three essential skills: riding, archery, and speaking the truth, though this was surely supplemented by instruction in statecraft, law, and the ancient customs that bound the Persian tribes together. As Cyrus reached maturity, the geopolitical situation that surrounded Anshan was becoming increasingly unstable. The Median Empire, which had reached its zenith under Cyaxares in the previous century, was showing signs of internal stress under the rule of Astyages. The king had grown old and perhaps complacent, while the various peoples under Median rule, Persians, Parthians, Bactrians, and others, were beginning to chafe under tribute obligations and foreign oversight. To the west, the Neo-Babylonian Empire was flexing its muscles under Nebuchadnezzar II, while to the northwest, the kingdom of Lydia was growing wealthy from trade and its legendary gold deposits. It was into this world of shifting alliances and emerging opportunities that Cyrus stepped when he inherited the throne of Anshan, probably sometime around 559 BCE. The transition appears to have been smooth, suggesting that Cambyses I had carefully prepared his succession and that the Persian nobility accepted Cyrus without significant opposition. Yet even in these early years of his reign, there were signs that this young king harbored ambitions that extended far beyond the traditional role of a Median vassal. The court records that have survived, fragmentary though they are, suggest that Cyrus immediately began implementing reforms that strengthened Persian identity while maintaining the diplomatic fiction of loyalty to media. He appears to have reorganized the Persian military along lines that emphasized mobility and coordination between different types of forces: infantry, cavalry, and archers working in concert rather than as separate units. These innovations drew on both the traditional fighting methods of the nomadic tribes and the more sophisticated military engineering that the Persians had learned from their contacts with Mesopotamian and Median armies. Perhaps more significantly, Cyrus began to articulate a vision of Persian destiny that transcended the tribal boundaries that had previously defined political identity on the Iranian plateau. Where earlier Persian rulers had been content to rule over their own people while acknowledging the supremacy of foreign overlords, Cyrus spoke of a unified Persian nation that would take its rightful place among the great powers of the ancient world. This message resonated not only among the Persian nobles who formed his inner circle, but also among the common people who had long chafed under the burden of tribute payments and foreign interference. The young king's charisma was apparently remarkable, even by the standards of an age that produced many legendary figures. Contemporary accounts, filtered through later historians, describe a man of extraordinary presence who could command loyalty not through fear or material reward alone, but through a genuine sense of shared purpose and destiny. He possessed the rare ability to make others believe that their individual fates were bound up with his own grand vision, and that by following him, they would become part of something greater than themselves. As word of this charismatic young Persian ruler spread beyond the borders of Anshan, it began to attract attention in courts throughout the ancient Near East. Babylon, Lydia, and even Egypt started to take note of developments in what had previously been considered a minor corner of the Median Empire. Some of these foreign observers may have seen opportunity in the growing tension between Cyrus and his nominal overlord Astyages, while others perhaps recognized the emergence of a force that might soon reshape the entire balance of power in their world. The stage was thus set for the great drama that would unfold over the following decades, as the boy from Anshan prepared to challenge not merely his Median overlords, but the entire established order of the ancient world. The morning mists that had long shrouded the ancient city of Ecbatana would soon lift to reveal a world transformed, though the transformation had been years in the making. Cyrus had grown from a provincial king ruling the mountainous realm of Anshan into something far more formidable, his ambitions stretching beyond the familiar peaks and valleys of his homeland toward the fertile plains controlled by his grandfather's empire. The relationship between grandfather and grandson had become a delicate dance of diplomacy and deception. With Astyages maintaining his throne in the magnificent capital, while Cyrus consolidated power among the Persian tribes with a patience that spoke of deeper purpose. The Median Empire had reached its zenith under Astyages, its influence extending from the Zagros Mountains to the edges of Anatolia, controlling the vital trade routes that connected the civilized world. The king's palace in Ecbatana rose like a jeweled crown from the surrounding hills, its walls adorned with the tribute of countless subject peoples, and its gardens watered by streams that had been diverted from distant mountain springs. Within these opulent chambers, Astyages held court, surrounded by the trappings of absolute power, yet increasingly he found his sleep troubled by dreams that seemed to whisper of approaching change. The Median nobles who had once competed for his favor now watched him with expressions that betrayed their growing unease, sensing perhaps that the old certainties were beginning to shift like sand beneath their feet. In the Persian highlands, meanwhile, Cyrus moved with the measured grace of a hunter who has learned to read the subtlest signs in wind and weather. His court at Anshan bore little resemblance to the gilded splendor of Ecbatana, yet it possessed something that his grandfather's palace increasingly lacked: the electric energy of a cause gaining momentum. The Persian nobles who gathered around their young king spoke not merely of preserving ancient privileges, but of destiny unfolding, their conversations carrying the weight of shared purpose rather than the brittle formality of established hierarchy. Cyrus listened to their words with the same attention he had once given to the mountain winds, understanding that loyalty freely given would prove far more durable than submission extracted through fear. The transformation of their relationship from family alliance to inevitable confrontation unfolded gradually, like the changing of seasons in the high country, where subtle shifts in light and temperature precede the dramatic arrival of winter storms. Astyages began to perceive in his grandson's growing confidence something that challenged the natural order he had spent decades establishing. While Cyrus found himself increasingly constrained by the expectations of vassalage, when his vision demanded the freedom to act according to his own judgment. Their diplomatic exchanges grew more formal, their meetings less frequent, and in the spaces between words, both men began to read the approaching future with the clarity that comes only to those who have learned to see beyond the immediate horizon. The Persian tribes that had long accepted Median overlordship with varying degrees of enthusiasm began to sense the changing currents flowing through their mountain valleys. In the marketplaces of Pasargadae and the highland settlements scattered throughout Cyrus's domain, conversations turned increasingly toward the possibility of a future shaped by Persian rather than Median hands. The tribal chieftains, who had once looked north toward Ecbatana for guidance, found themselves drawn instead to the growing circle around their young king, recognizing in him something that transcended the traditional boundaries of clan and region. The ancient bonds of kinship and shared heritage that had always existed among the Persian peoples began to crystallize into something approaching unity. Forged not through conquest, but through the magnetic pull of leadership that promised both glory and freedom. When the final break came, it arrived not with the sudden violence of an earthquake, but with the inexorable force of a river that has found its true course after centuries of meandering through uncertain terrain. The exact nature of the provocations that pushed grandfather and grandson beyond the point of reconciliation became the subject of countless stories in later years. Tales that spoke of slights real and imagined, of ambassadors dismissed and tributes refused, of dreams and omens that seemed to demand action. What remained constant in all these accounts was the sense that both men had recognized the fundamental incompatibility of their visions for the future, understanding that the world was no longer large enough to contain both their ambitions. Astyages gathered his forces with the methodical thoroughness of a king who had spent decades maintaining order through the calculated application of military might. The Median army that assembled at his command represented the accumulated power of generations, its ranks filled with warriors drawn from across the empire, and its commanders seasoned by years of successful campaigns against rebellious vassals and foreign enemies. The sight of this host preparing for war must have stirred memories of countless previous victories, campaigns that had extended Median influence deep into distant lands and brought tribute flowing back to enrich the royal treasury. Yet something in the quality of the preparations suggested that Astyages understood this campaign would differ fundamentally from all that had come before. The forces that answered Cyrus's call bore little resemblance to the professional armies that had become the standard throughout the civilized world. These were men bound together not by the promise of regular pay or the fear of military discipline, but by ties of blood, tradition, and shared conviction that their young king offered them a future worth fighting to secure. The Persian warriors who gathered in the mountain passes moved with the fluid coordination of men who had learned their trade in the harsh school of tribal warfare. Their equipment simpler than that of their enemies, but their purpose clarified by the certainty that they fought not merely for conquest, but for the right to determine their own destiny. Their camps echoed with the ancient songs of their people, melodies that spoke of heroes and journeys, of promises made by ancestors and debts that could only be paid through courage displayed on the battlefield. The campaign that followed would be remembered not for its duration, but for the profound transformation it accomplished, sweeping away the established order with a thoroughness that surprised even those who had initiated the conflict. The Median forces, despite their numerical advantage and superior equipment, found themselves facing an enemy that refused to conform to their expectations of how such wars should unfold. Where they anticipated formal battles between massed formations, they encountered instead a fluid campaign of movement and maneuver that denied them the opportunity to bring their full strength to bear. The Persian forces seemed to materialize from the mountain mists at unexpected moments, striking with devastating effectiveness before melting back into terrain they knew as intimately as their own heartbeats. The psychological impact of these encounters spread through the median ranks like ripples across still water, undermining the confidence that had sustained them through previous campaigns. Soldiers who had never questioned their superiority began to whisper among themselves about the strange quality of their enemies. The way they fought with a fierce joy that seemed to transcend mere military training. The Median commanders found their traditional tactics increasingly ineffective against opponents who appeared to have internalized completely different assumptions about the nature of warfare itself. Treating each engagement not as a formal duel between professional armies, but as an opportunity to demonstrate the validity of their cause through deeds that would echo through generations. The climactic confrontation, when it finally came, unfolded with a speed and decisiveness that left observers struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what they had witnessed. The careful plans that Astyages had developed through months of preparation seemed to dissolve in the face of a reality that refused to conform to his expectations. While the forces he had counted upon to restore the traditional order found themselves swept along by currents too powerful to resist. In the aftermath of that final battle, as the dust settled over a battlefield that had become the graveyard of an empire, the world discovered that the age of Median dominance had ended not with a gradual decline, but with the sudden, shocking finality of an avalanche that reshapes the entire landscape in a matter of moments. The fall of Astyages marked more than the defeat of a single ruler or the collapse of a particular dynasty. It represented the emergence of a fundamentally new conception of empire itself, where the Median system had been built upon the familiar foundations of tribute, submission, and the careful balance of competing regional powers. The Persian victory announced the arrival of something unprecedented in its scope and revolutionary in its implications. The young king, who had begun as a provincial vassal, had transformed himself into the architect of a new world order, one that would ultimately stretch from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River and establish patterns of governance that would influence human civilization for centuries to come. The dust of Median battlefields had barely settled when Cyrus turned his calculating gaze westward, toward the shimmering lands of Anatolia, where the kingdom of Lydia sprawled in golden magnificence. The collapse of Astyages had sent ripples across the ancient world, and nowhere were these tremors felt more acutely than in the opulent court of Croesus, whose legendary wealth had become synonymous with earthly abundance itself. The Lydian king, perched upon his throne in the marble halls of Sardis, watched with growing unease as reports filtered in from the eastern frontiers, each messenger bearing news more troubling than the last. Croesus ruled over a realm that had grown fat on the riches of trade, its position at the crossroads between Europe and Asia, making it the natural conduit for the golden streams of commerce that flowed between distant civilizations. The very coins that clinked in the purses of merchants throughout the known world bore the stamp of Lydian mints, for it was here, in these fertile valleys, that humanity had first learned to transform raw metal into the standardized currency that would revolutionize trade forever. The kingdom's treasury vaults groaned beneath the weight of accumulated treasures, room after room filled with bars of electrum, that pale gold-silver alloy that seemed to capture and hold the very light of the sun within its lustrous surface. The capital city of Sardis rose like a jeweled crown from the Hermus River Valley, its terraced gardens cascading down the slopes of the Acropolis in a symphony of green and gold. Cypresses stood sentinel among groves of olive trees whose silver leaves caught the morning breeze, while below in the markets the air hung heavy with the perfume of frankincense and myrrh, cinnamon bark from distant Ceylon, and the earthy richness of saffron threads worth more than their weight in gold. Merchants from every corner of the civilized world congregated in the great bazaars, their voices rising in a polyglot chorus as they haggled over silks from distant Serica, amber from the northern seas, and precious stones that had been torn from the earth in lands so remote their very names were whispered like incantations. Cyrus understood that Lydia represented far more than mere territorial expansion. It was the key that would unlock the riches of the Western world. The Persian king had witnessed how the tentacles of Lydian influence stretched across the Aegean, how Greek city-states bowed before Croesus's golden supremacy, paying tribute in exchange for protection and trade privileges. To conquer Lydia would be to inherit not just a kingdom, but an entire economic empire. A vast network of commercial relationships that had taken generations to establish and nurture. The Persian army that assembled for the Western campaign was unlike any force that had marched before it, a cosmopolitan host that reflected the multi-ethnic character of Cyrus's expanding empire. Median cavalry units, their horses bred from the finest bloodlines of the Zagros Mountains, rode alongside Persian infantry whose discipline had been forged in the crucible of mountain warfare. Bactrian horsemen from the eastern satrapies brought their knowledge of mobility and speed, while contingents of Scythian archers contributed their legendary accuracy with the composite bow, that marvel of nomadic engineering whose range and power had made the horse peoples masters of the steppes. As this diverse army began its westward march, the very landscape seemed to part before it like a vast curtain being drawn aside. The familiar peaks of the Iranian plateau gradually gave way to the rolling hills of Anatolia, where ancient trade routes wound through valleys dotted with caravanserai and the ruins of forgotten civilizations. Each mile covered brought them deeper into a world where Greek architectural influences mingled with local traditions, where the temples bore inscriptions in scripts both familiar and strange, and where the very air seemed to shimmer with the accumulated wealth of centuries. Croesus, meanwhile, had not remained idle in the face of this approaching threat. The Lydian king had dispatched envoys to every corner of his diplomatic network, calling upon ancient alliances and promising vast rewards to any who would stand with him against the Persian tide. Egyptian gold flowed northward, along with promises of military support, while Spartan warriors sharpened their bronze-tipped spears and debated the wisdom of intervention in this distant conflict. The oracle at Delphi, that enigmatic voice of divine wisdom, delivered pronouncements wrapped in the usual ambiguity that had made her counsel both sought after and feared throughout the Hellenic world. The first skirmishes between Persian scouts and Lydian border guards took place among the ruins of ancient Hittite strongholds, where weathered stone reliefs still depicted the forgotten glories of chariot warfare and divine kingship. These preliminary encounters revealed the stark differences between the two military traditions. The Lydians fought with the disciplined formations inherited from their Greek allies, their bronze armor gleaming like mirrors in the harsh Anatolian sun, while the Persians employed the fluid tactics of the steppes, striking swift and hard before melting away into the landscape like morning mist. As the Persian host drew nearer to Sardis, the countryside began to empty of its normal inhabitants, farmers and herders driving their livestock into the fortified towns, while merchants buried their most precious goods in hidden caches, marking the locations with secret signs known only to their most trusted associates. The great trade routes that had pulsed with commercial life for centuries fell silent, their caravanserais echoing with emptiness, save for the occasional Persian patrol that clattered through their courtyards like harbingers of a new age. The final approach to Sardis took the Persian army through a landscape that seemed designed by the gods themselves as a fitting stage for the clash of empires. Vineyards heavy with purple clusters stretched across rolling hills, where shepherds had once composed songs that echoed across the valleys, while olive groves older than memory cast their eternal shadows over fields that had fed generations of Lydian prosperity. Ancient burial mounds dotted the horizon, their weathered stones marking the resting places of forgotten kings, whose own ambitions had once seemed as eternal as the mountains themselves. Within the walls of Sardis, Croesus made his final preparations with the methodical precision of a monarch who had never known defeat. the royal armories were thrown open, releasing the accumulated weaponry of generations. Shields bearing the golden lion of Lydia, spears whose points had been forged by master smiths using techniques passed down through centuries, and suits of scale armor that caught the light like the skin of mythical serpents. The palace workshops hummed with activity as craftsmen worked around the clock to repair equipment and fashion new instruments of war, their hammers ringing out a metallic rhythm that seemed to echo the beating heart of an empire preparing for its ultimate test. The treasury vaults were opened one final time, their contents catalogued and distributed among the various contingents of the royal army, for Croesus understood that loyalty in the face of foreign invasion required more than mere patriotic fervour. Golden darricks changed hands with practiced efficiency, while chests of silver tetradrachms were loaded onto pack animals whose destinies would soon be decided on the fields of battle. Even as these preparations reached their fever pitch, however, there remained an almost dreamlike quality to the proceedings, as if the participants could hardly believe that the age of Lydian supremacy might be drawing to its close. The stage was set for one of history's most consequential encounters, where the rising power of Persia would meet the accumulated wealth and diplomatic sophistication of the ancient world's greatest commercial empire. In the gathering dusk, as cooking fires began to twinkle across both camps like earthbound constellations, few could have imagined that they stood witness to the final moments of an era, or that the outcome of the coming battle would reshape the very foundations of civilization itself. With Lydia's treasures flowing into Persian coffers, and Croesus himself now an advisor within the expanding court, Cyrus turned his attention eastward, toward the vast expanse of the Iranian plateau that stretched beyond the familiar valleys of Fars. The conquest of Croesus had demonstrated Persian military prowess to the Western world, but the true test of empire lay not in spectacular victories against distant kingdoms, but in the patient work of binding together the fractured highlands that formed the backbone of the ancient world. These were lands where hardy mountain peoples had lived for centuries in fierce independence, their loyalties bound to clan and valley rather than crown, their traditions as enduring as the stone peaks that sheltered their settlements. The Iranian highlands presented a geography both magnificent and merciless, a tapestry of soaring ranges separated by fertile valleys, where ancient rivers carved their patient paths toward distant seas. Here, the Zagros Mountains rose in parallel ridges, their limestone faces catching the morning light in shades of gold and amber, while beyond them stretched the vast central plateau, a land of extremes where scorching summers gave way to winters of bitter cold. The air itself seemed different at these altitudes, thinner and somehow more precious, carrying the scent of wild herbs and the distant promise of snow from peaks that touched the sky. This was terrain that had shaped its inhabitants across countless generations, creating peoples as resilient and unyielding as the landscape itself. Among these mountain communities, Cyrus encountered the Bactrians, whose kingdom straddled the upper reaches of the Oxus River in lands that would one day be called Afghanistan. Their capital cities rose from oasis valleys where irrigation channels, carved with infinite patience from living rock, transformed desert margins into gardens of plenty. The Bactrians were master horsemen, their cavalry formations moving across the steppes with the fluid precision of migrating herds, their composite bows capable of striking targets at distances that seemed impossible to those accustomed to the shorter ranges of Western warfare. Their nobles wore silk that had travelled the length of Asia, while their craftsmen worked gold and silver into intricate patterns that spoke of trade connections reaching far into the mysterious lands beyond the sunrise. The process of bringing such peoples into the Persian fold required a diplomacy as subtle as it was persistent. Cyrus understood that the hammer of military conquest, while occasionally necessary, could shatter as easily as it could forge. Instead, he employed what might be called a politics of respect, acknowledging the dignity of local customs, while gradually weaving these diverse communities into a larger tapestry of Persian governance. Local rulers found themselves elevated to the status of satraps, their traditional authority not merely preserved, but enhanced through connection to the growing Persian administrative system. Ancient festivals continued to mark the turning of seasons, but they now celebrated not only local deities, but also the broader prosperity that Persian rule had brought to their lands. The integration of the Sogdians, whose fertile valleys lay between the Oxus and Jaxartes rivers, exemplified this careful balance between conquest and accommodation. These were merchants and farmers whose cities had grown wealthy from their position along the emerging trade routes that connected the Mediterranean world with the markets of distant China. Their bazaars filled with the music of many languages, their warehouses storing goods that bore the marks of craftsmen from lands whose very names seemed like poetry. Persian administrators worked alongside Sogdian nobles to standardize weights and measures, to ensure the security of caravan routes, and to establish the way stations that would make long-distance trade both safer and more profitable. Further east, the territories of Gandhara and the Upper Indus presented challenges of a different nature. Here, the landscape shifted from the familiar aridity of the Iranian plateau to something approaching the lush abundance of river deltas, where monsoon rains transformed valleys into temporary seas of green abundance. The peoples of these regions had developed architectural traditions that reflected their unique environment. Building cities of fired brick that could withstand both flooding and earthquake, creating works of art that captured the flowing movement of water and the patient growth of vegetation. Their religious practices, too, reflected this closer connection to cycles of abundance and scarcity, with rituals that honored both the life-giving power of water and the fierce necessity of seasonal preparation. The Persian approach to governing these eastern territories required innovations in administration that would influence statecraft for centuries to come. Cyrus established a system of royal roads that connected the farthest provinces to the heartland of Persepolis, with relay stations positioned at intervals that allowed mounted messengers to cross vast distances in times that seemed miraculous to contemporaries. Along these routes, official languages mingled with local dialects, creating a multilingual administrative culture where Persian scribes worked alongside local scholars to maintain records in scripts as diverse as the peoples they governed. The famous Persian tolerance for local customs found its fullest expression in these eastern provinces, where Zoroastrian fire altars stood alongside Buddhist stupas and temples dedicated to deities whose worship stretched back to the dawn of human settlement in these valleys. The wealth that flowed from these consolidated territories transformed the very nature of Persian power. No longer was the empire dependent solely on the agricultural surplus of the Iranian heartland or the plunder of military campaigns. Instead, a complex economic system emerged, based on the systematic taxation of trade routes, the careful management of agricultural surplus from dozens of fertile valleys, and the exploitation of mineral resources that ranged from the famous lapis lazuli mines of Badakhshan to the gold deposits that glittered in mountain streams from the Hindu Kush to the Pamirs. Persian engineers, working with local experts who had inherited generations of accumulated knowledge, developed new techniques for extracting and refining these resources, creating workshops where precious metals were transformed into the coins that would become the standard currency across much of the known world. The cultural synthesis that emerged from this period of consolidation created something genuinely new in the ancient world. Persian nobles found their courts enriched by the artistic traditions of a dozen different peoples, their tables graced by foods that represented the agricultural abundance of climates ranging from Mediterranean to almost tropical. The great Persian gardens, which would become legendary throughout the ancient world, reflected this cultural diversity, combining the geometric precision of Mesopotamian irrigation with the flowing naturalism of Eastern landscape design and the symbolic plant arrangements that spoke of religious traditions spanning from Egypt to India. In these gardens, fountains played with water that might have traveled hundreds of miles through the qanat systems that Persian engineers were perfecting, while shade trees from distant forests provided relief from the intensity of the Iranian sun. drawing warriors from every corner of the expanding empire. Median cavalry rode alongside Lydian horsemen, their bronze armor burnished to mirror brightness, while contingents of Scythian archers tested their bowstrings in the cool morning air. The diversity of this force reflected Cyrus's genius for incorporating conquered peoples not as reluctant subjects, but as valued partners in his grand imperial project. The siege began not with thunderous assaults against the walls, but with the patient work of engineers who understood that Babylon's greatest strength could be transformed into its most vulnerable weakness. The city's lifeline flowed through the Euphrates River, which passed directly beneath the massive walls through specially constructed water gates that had been designed to prevent exactly the kind of assault Cyrus now contemplated. Persian engineers, working in shifts throughout the blazing heat of summer days and the surprising chill of desert nights, began the monumental task of diverting the river's flow. Upstream from the city, thousands of workers labored to construct an enormous artificial channel that would carry the Euphrates away from its ancient course. The work proceeded in absolute secrecy, hidden from Babylonian scouts by carefully positioned screens of reeds and earth. Day after day, the sound of shovels biting into rich river mud created a rhythm that echoed across the marshlands, while ox-drawn carts hauled away countless tons of excavated soil. The scale of this undertaking dwarfed even the great public works projects for which Babylon itself had become famous throughout the known world. Within the city walls, King Nabonidus and his court maintained their confidence in the impregnability of their ancient fortress. The royal palace, with its terraced gardens cascading down toward the river in a series of green steps, continued to host elaborate banquets where courtiers discussed philosophy and astronomy, while musicians played on instruments of silver and ivory. The great ziggurat of Marduk dominated the city's skyline, its 7 levels climbing toward heaven, in a testament to Babylonian engineering prowess and religious devotion that had endured since the days when Hammurabi first codified the laws of civilization. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, tensions simmered through the diverse population that called Babylon home. Among the city's inhabitants lived thousands of Jewish exiles, descendants of those who had been carried away from Jerusalem during the conquests of Nebuchadnezzar nearly half a century earlier. These displaced people had built new lives along the canals of Babylon, establishing communities where the songs of Zion mingled with the sounds of Mesopotamian commerce. Their longing for home had never entirely faded, and whispered rumors began to circulate that the Persian king who now surrounded their city might prove to be the deliverer their prophets had foretold. The night chosen for the final assault arrived with unusual darkness, as thick clouds obscured the moon and stars that normally illuminated the Mesopotamian plain. Persian sappers made their final preparations along the artificial channel, while select units of the most trusted soldiers took their positions near the water gates that would soon provide access to the city's heart. The timing had to be perfect, for the window of opportunity would remain open only long enough for the river level to drop sufficiently, while darkness still provided concealment for the attacking forces. As the diverted waters began to flow through their new course, the ancient Euphrates gradually receded from its bed beneath Babylon's walls. What had been an impassable torrent became first a rushing stream, then a series of scattered pools connected by channels shallow enough for determined soldiers to wade through without losing their footing. The massive water gates, designed to regulate river traffic in times of peace and prevent naval assault during war, now stood exposed like gaping wounds in the city's otherwise impenetrable defenses. The Persian forces moved through the empty riverbed with the silence of shadows, their footsteps muffled by thick mud that clung to their sandals and reminded them of the fertile earth from which this great city had originally grown. Above them, the walls of Babylon loomed like cliffs of brick and bitumen, their surfaces still warm from the day's heat, but cooling rapidly in the pre-dawn air. Guards paced their appointed rounds along the battlements, but their attention remained focused outward toward the Persian camps that flickered with campfires on the distant plain, never suspecting that the real assault was already flowing beneath their feet. Once inside the city's outer defences, the Persians moved swiftly but without panic through streets that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires for more than 1,000 years. The architecture of Babylon reflected this deep history, with buildings that incorporated styles and techniques from dozens of different periods and cultures. Ancient Sumerian foundations supported walls built during the Akkadian period, while Assyrian decorative elements adorned facades that had been restored and modified by successive generations of Babylonian craftsmen. The capture of the city proceeded with remarkable restraint, reflecting Cyrus's consistent policy of treating conquered populations with dignity and respect. Rather than unleashing his soldiers to plunder and destroy, the Persian king had given strict instructions that the temples, libraries, and residential quarters were to be protected from unnecessary damage. This approach paid immediate dividends as word spread through the city that the conquerors came not as destroyers, but as liberators who respected local customs and religious practices. Among those who welcomed the Persian arrival with particular joy were the Jewish communities scattered throughout Babylon's various districts. For these exiled people, Cyrus's conquest represented far more than a mere change in political authority. The Persian king had already gained a reputation throughout his territories for restoring displaced peoples to their ancestral homes and allowing the reconstruction of local temples and religious centers. As dawn broke over the conquered city, Jewish leaders began to approach Persian officials with petitions that had been prepared in hope for exactly this moment. The Great Proclamation that would forever link Cyrus's name with Jewish history emerged from these early meetings between conqueror and conquered. In language that reflected both practical political wisdom and genuine religious tolerance, the Persian king announced that all peoples who had been forcibly relocated to Babylon during previous conquests were free to return to their homelands if they so desired. Moreover, he promised royal support for the reconstruction of their local temples and the restoration of their traditional religious practices. For the Jewish exiles, this decree meant the possibility of return to Jerusalem and the rebuilding of Solomon's temple, which had been destroyed during Nebuchadnezzar's conquest. The emotional impact of this announcement rippled through the Jewish community like waves spreading across the surface of a still pond. Elderly men and women who had never expected to see their homeland again began to weep openly in the streets, while younger generations who had been born in exile suddenly faced the prospect of journeying to a land they knew only through the stories and songs of their parents. The administrative machinery required to implement such a massive relocation program demonstrated the sophisticated governmental systems that Cyrus had developed throughout his empire. Persian officials worked closely with Jewish community leaders to organize the return journey, providing not only safe passage, but also financial support for the reconstruction projects that would be necessary once the returning exiles reached Jerusalem. Sacred vessels and treasures that had been carried away from the original temple were carefully catalogued and prepared for transport, their gold and silver surfaces polished until they gleamed with the promise of renewed worship in their proper home. As autumn arrived, and the first groups of returning exiles prepared to depart Babylon, the significance of what had transpired became clear to observers throughout the ancient world. The siege and liberation of Babylon represented more than a military victory. It marked the emergence of an entirely new model of imperial governance, based on cultural tolerance and administrative flexibility, rather than simple domination through force. The dust of Babylon had barely settled when whispers began to spread across the empire of something unprecedented, something that would reshape the very foundations of how civilizations might coexist. In the quiet chambers where scribes worked by lamplight, copying proclamations that would echo through millennia, a new philosophy was taking written form. The conquering Persians, rather than imposing their beliefs upon the conquered, were articulating principles that would stand as monuments to human dignity long after their armies had returned to dust. Cyrus had witnessed firsthand the suffering that religious persecution could inflict. The empty temples of Babylon, the scattered peoples of countless faiths, The broken altars where offerings had once been made with joy, all spoke to the futility of forcing one people to abandon their connection to the divine in favor of another's understanding. The Persian king, secure in his own relationship with Ahura Mazda, began to perceive that the strength of an empire might lie not in the uniformity of its beliefs, but in the richness of its diversity. Like a tapestry, woven from threads of countless colors, each contributing to the beauty of the whole. The revolutionary edict that emerged from the royal scriptoriums was unlike anything the ancient world had ever witnessed. Where previous conquerors had demanded submission to their gods, Cyrus proclaimed that each people should worship according to their ancestral customs. Where others had torn down sacred places to build monuments to their own deities, the Persian decree called for the restoration of temples, the return of sacred objects, the rebuilding of holy places that had been desecrated by previous overlords. The very stones seemed to exhale with relief as craftsmen once again took up their tools to repair what had been broken, to restore what had been lost. In the workshops of Babylon, elderly artisans, who had thought never again to carve the sacred symbols of their fathers, found their hands steady once more as they worked precious metals into ritual objects. The sound of hammers on bronze rang out with a music that spoke of resurrection, of traditions returning from the edge of extinction. Children who had only heard whispered stories of their people's customs now watched openly as elders demonstrated rituals that had been hidden for generations. The ancient movements flowing like water that had finally found its course after being dammed too long. The Persian administration began to develop structures that could accommodate this unprecedented diversity. Rather than replacing local governments entirely, Persian satraps learned to work alongside traditional authorities, creating hybrid systems that honored both imperial needs and local customs. In the halls where these negotiations took place, translators worked tirelessly to bridge not merely languages, but entire worldviews. Finding ways for Persian law to coexist with Babylonian tradition, for imperial taxation to flow alongside temple offerings, for the great empire to function as a symphony rather than a single, overwhelming note. The restoration of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem became perhaps the most visible symbol of this new approach. Persian gold flowed toward the holy city, funding not the construction of a monument to Cyrus, but the rebuilding of a house of worship for a people whose god the Persians did not worship, whose customs they did not share. The sound of construction rose from the Temple Mount as exiled craftsmen returned to practice skills their fathers had taught them, working with wood and stone and precious metal to recreate something that lived more perfectly in memory than it ever had in reality. News of these policies spread along the trade routes like seeds on the wind, taking root in communities that had suffered under previous regimes. In distant satrapies, local priests emerged from hiding, bringing forth sacred texts that had been buried, ritual objects that had been concealed, oral traditions that had been whispered only in the deepest darkness. The empire began to resonate with the prayers of 100 different faiths, each offering their own understanding of the divine, their own path toward the sacred, their own contribution to the spiritual life of the realm. The Persian concept of truth, Asha, proved flexible enough to encompass this multiplicity of religious expression. Rather than claiming exclusive access to divine truth, Persian theology suggested that truth was vast enough to be approached by many paths, that the light of Ahura Mazda was brilliant enough to illuminate different peoples in different ways. This philosophical sophistication allowed Persian administrators to navigate the complex religious landscape of their empire with a wisdom that seemed almost prophetic, anticipating conflicts before they arose, finding common ground where others saw only difference. Cultural preservation became as important as religious tolerance in this revolutionary approach to empire. Local festivals continued to mark the seasons, their ancient rhythms undisturbed by Persian conquest. Traditional music filled the air during celebrations that had been old when Cyrus was young. Instruments that predated the Persian Empire by centuries, accompanying dances that told stories older than written history. The empire began to pulse with countless cultural heartbeats, each maintaining its own rhythm while somehow contributing to a greater synchronization. The Persian court itself became a showcase for this cultural diversity. Ambassadors arrived wearing the traditional dress of their peoples, speaking their native languages, bringing gifts that reflected their local specialties. The great audience halls of Persepolis, still rising stone by stone in the Persian heartland, were designed to accommodate this variety, with spaces for different customs of greeting, different protocols of respect, different understandings of how mortals should approach the divine king, who nonetheless honored their right to approach their own gods in their own ways. Scribes working in the royal archives found themselves recording laws in languages they did not speak, copying out regulations that honored customs they did not practice. The administrative complexity was staggering, yet somehow the system functioned, sustained by the radical notion that an empire might be strengthened rather than weakened by the preservation of its component parts. Local legal traditions continued alongside Persian imperial law, creating a layered system of justice that could address conflicts between peoples of different cultures without forcing either to abandon their fundamental beliefs about right and wrong. The economic implications of this tolerance proved equally revolutionary. Merchants who had feared to practice their traditional methods of conducting business found that Persian rule actually enhanced their opportunities. Trade networks that had been disrupted by religious conflicts began to flourish again as communities that had been isolated by persecution reconnected with their traditional partners. The empire's markets filled with goods that carried not just economic value, but cultural significance. Items that would have been forbidden under less tolerant regimes, now changing hands freely, carrying their stories and traditions along with their practical utility. This grand experiment in coexistence created ripples that would spread far beyond the boundaries of the Persian Empire, establishing principles that would influence human civilization for millennia to come. The idea that political power and religious authority could be separated, that diversity might be a source of strength rather than weakness, that different peoples might contribute to a common good while maintaining their distinct identities. These concepts, born in the administrative chambers and audience halls of ancient Persia, would echo through history, inspiring later empires, informing the dreams of philosophers, and offering hope to countless peoples who found themselves subject to powers that ruled over them, but, in the Persian model, need not rule their hearts, their traditions, or their most sacred understanding of their place in the cosmos. This revolutionary approach to governance through tolerance and preservation created the foundation for what would become one of history's most sophisticated administrative systems. The Persian Empire, stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, presented challenges that no ruler had ever faced before. Managing such vast territories, with their countless peoples, languages, customs, and geographical barriers, required innovations that would fundamentally reshape how empires could function. Cyrus and his successors understood that brute force alone could never maintain control over such distances and diversity. The solution emerged in the form of the satrap system, an administrative masterpiece that balanced central authority with local autonomy. The word satrap itself, derived from the Old Persian shathrapavan, meaning protector of the kingdom, embodied the delicate relationship between the Persian court and its far-flung provinces. These regional governors served as the living extension of the king's will, yet they possessed the flexibility to adapt imperial policies to local conditions and traditions. Each satrap ruled over a carefully defined territory, their boundaries often following natural features like mountain ranges, rivers, or cultural divisions that had existed for centuries before Persian conquest. The selection of satraps revealed the sophisticated understanding of power dynamics that characterized Persian administration. Rather than appointing only Persian nobles, the empire often chose governors from local aristocratic families who already commanded respect and understanding within their regions. This practice transformed potential rebels into invested partners in imperial success. A former Lydian king might find himself governing his ancestral lands under Persian authority, his intimate knowledge of local customs and languages making him far more effective than any foreign administrator could hope to be. The system created a web of loyalty that extended outward from Persepolis, binding distant provinces to the center through relationships rather than mere fear. The administrative structure beneath each satrap operated like a miniature version of the imperial government itself. Provincial treasurers managed the collection and storage of taxes, ensuring that the steady flow of silver, gold, and goods reached the royal treasuries. Military commanders maintained order and defended borders, their forces a mixture of local levies and Persian regulars. Scribes recorded everything in multiple languages, their careful documentation creating an information network that allowed the central government to monitor conditions across thousands of miles. These records traveled along carefully maintained routes, carried by mounted messengers who moved with precision through a landscape that had been transformed into a vast communication system. The Royal Road represented perhaps the most ambitious infrastructure project the ancient world had yet seen. Stretching over 1,600 miles from Sardis in Anatolia to Susa in the Persian heartland, this highway served as the empire's circulatory system, carrying information, goods, and officials across distances that had previously taken months to traverse. The road itself was more than merely a path worn by countless feet and hooves. Persian engineers had created a thoroughfare that remained passable in all seasons, with carefully graded surfaces that allowed wheeled vehicles to move efficiently across terrain that ranged from coastal plains to mountain passes. Every 14 miles along this great highway, relay stations provided fresh horses for the imperial messenger service, an innovation that compressed communication time in ways that seemed almost magical to contemporary observers. Where merchants might require months to carry news from one end of the empire to the other, royal messengers could complete the journey in a matter of days. The stations themselves became small communities, housing not only the horse handlers and messengers, but also innkeepers, blacksmiths, and merchants who served the constant stream of travelers. Guards protected these vital links in the communication chain, understanding that any disruption could leave entire provinces isolated from the imperial center. The economic implications of this infrastructure extended far beyond its military and administrative functions. The Royal Road and its network of secondary highways created the world's first truly international marketplace. Merchants from Greek city-states could travel safely to Bactria, their goods protected by Persian law and their routes secured by imperial garrisons. Lydian coins circulated in Indian markets, while silk from the distant east found its way to workshops in Anatolia. The standardization of weights and measures across the empire eliminated countless barriers to trade, while the imperial guarantee of safe passage attracted merchants from regions far beyond Persian borders. This commercial integration required sophisticated systems for currency exchange and credit. Persian goldsmiths and moneylenders developed techniques for transferring wealth across vast distances without the physical transport of heavy coins. A merchant departing from Babylon with goods bound for Sardis could deposit silver in one city and withdraw equivalent value in local currency at his destination, the transaction recorded and verified through a network of trusted agents. These financial innovations laid the groundwork for commercial practices that would influence trade throughout the Mediterranean and Asian worlds for centuries to come. The satrap system's genius lay in its ability to adapt to the specific needs and conditions of each province while maintaining overall imperial coherence. In Egypt, the satrap worked within existing pharaonic administrative structures, presenting himself as the latest in a line of divine rulers while implementing Persian policies through traditional Egyptian bureaucracies. In Ionia, Greek city-states retained their internal governance and cultural practices, contributing ships and tribute to the imperial system while conducting their own local affairs. This flexibility prevented the kind of constant rebellions that plagued other ancient empires, where rigid central control created perpetual friction with local traditions. The flow of information through this administrative network created an intelligence system of unprecedented sophistication. Regular reports from satraps provided the Persian court with detailed knowledge of conditions throughout the empire. Harvests, political tensions, military threats, and economic opportunities were all documented and transmitted along the royal road's messenger service. This information allowed the central government to respond to problems before they became crises, sending additional troops to threatened frontiers or economic aid to regions struck by natural disasters. The royal inspectors, known as the King's Eyes and Ears, provided an additional layer of oversight that ensured the satrap system remained loyal to imperial interests. These officials travelled throughout the provinces on irregular schedules, their surprise appearances serving as both audit and encouragement. They verified tax collections, reviewed military preparations, and investigated complaints against local administrators. Their reports flowed directly to the royal court, creating a parallel information stream that could detect corruption or disloyalty before it threatened imperial stability. The cultural impact of this administrative system extended far beyond mere governance. The constant movement of officials, merchants, and messengers along the royal road created an unprecedented exchange of ideas, technologies, and artistic influences. Persian architectural styles incorporated elements from conquered territories, while local artisans learned techniques that had originated thousands of miles away. Languages borrowed words from each other, creating a polyglot vocabulary that reflected the empire's diversity. Religious practices, philosophical concepts, and scientific knowledge flowed along the same routes that carried political dispatches and commercial goods. This administrative masterpiece would outlast the empire that created it, its innovations adopted and adapted by successor states throughout the ancient world. The Roman Empire's provincial system owed much to Persian precedents, while the Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged from Alexander's conquests retained many aspects of satrapial administration. Even today, the principles of delegated authority balanced with central oversight continue to influence how large organizations manage complex, geographically distributed operations. The Persian achievement in creating stable governance across such vast distances and cultural differences remains one of history's most remarkable administrative accomplishments. The administrative networks that bound the Persian Empire together were merely the skeleton upon which stretched flesh of unimaginable vastness. From the Hindu Kush mountains, where snow-fed rivers carved ancient paths toward the Indus, to the wine-dark waters of the Aegean, where Greek islands dotted the horizon like scattered pearls, Cyrus the Great had woven together a tapestry of lands so diverse that morning prayers rose in a dozen tongues, while the sun completed its daily journey across his dominions. The empire that emerged from his conquests was not merely large, it was a living organism that breathed with the rhythms of monsoons in the east and Mediterranean storms in the west. Its heartbeat synchronized to the footsteps of couriers who carried royal messages across distances that would have seemed mythical to earlier generations. At the empire's easternmost reaches, the provinces of Gandhara and Bactria nestled against mountain ranges, where peaks pierced clouds, and ancient trade routes wound through passes that had witnessed the migration of peoples since time immemorial. Here, in valleys where Buddhist monasteries would one day echo with chanted sutras, Persian governors administered territories where the scent of cardamom and cinnamon mingled with the thin air of high altitudes. The Indus River, swollen with Himalayan melt, carried not only silt and commerce, but also the cultural currents that would blend Persian administrative wisdom with local traditions stretching back to the Harappan civilization. Merchants in Taxila counted coins bearing Cyrus's image while conducting business in languages that predated written history, their transactions recorded on clay tablets that documented the extraordinary reach of Persian influence into lands where elephants trumpeted in royal courts and monsoon rains drummed against palace rooftops with seasonal predictability. Moving westward across the empire's breadth, the landscape transformed gradually from the dust-brown hills of Afghanistan to the fertile river valleys of Mesopotamia, where date palms cast afternoon shadows over irrigation channels that had nourished civilizations for millennia. Babylon, that ancient queen of cities, now flew Persian banners from ziggurats that had watched the rise and fall of Hammurabi's descendants. The Hanging Gardens, if they truly existed as more than poetic imagination, would have perfumed the air with exotic blooms, tended by gardeners who served Persian satraps rather than native kings. Along the Euphrates, the rhythmic sound of water wheels turning in the current provided a constant soundtrack to daily life in a city where Aramaic, Akkadian, and Old Persian mingled in the markets, creating a linguistic symphony that reflected the empire's multicultural embrace. The Levantine coast presented its own particular character to Persian rule, where ancient Phoenician ports had grown wealthy on purple dye and cedar wood traded across Mediterranean waters. Sidon and Tyre, those maritime jewels, continued their seafaring traditions under Persian sovereignty, their ships now carrying not only traditional cargoes, but also imperial messages and Persian officials to distant shores. The cedar forests of Lebanon rustled with winds that carried salt from the sea, their resinous fragrance mixing with incense from Arabian trade routes that wound inland through Damascus and Jerusalem. In these coastal cities, the sound of waves against harbour stones created a rhythmic backdrop for negotiations conducted in Persian satrap palaces, where local merchants adapted their ancient commercial practices to accommodate the administrative requirements of their new imperial masters. Egypt, that gift of the Nile, brought its own profound antiquity to the Persian embrace, where pharaonic traditions stretching back 3 millennia encountered the organizational genius of Cyrus's governmental system. The annual flood that turned the Nile Valley into a temporary sea of fertile mud continued its eternal cycle. But now Persian administrators calculated tax assessments based on flood levels and crop yields with mathematical precision that complemented rather than replaced traditional Egyptian agricultural wisdom. Temples dedicated to Isis and Osiris stood alongside Persian fire altars, their respective priesthoods learning to navigate the diplomatic complexities of religious coexistence. In Memphis and Thebes, the morning call of ibises along the riverbank mixed with the chanted prayers of Zoroastrian magi, creating an audio landscape that embodied the cultural synthesis occurring throughout the empire. The Anatolian plateau, with its harsh winters and blazing summers, presented terrain that varied from the pastoral valleys where shepherds tended flocks of sheep and goats to the mineral-rich mountains where mining operations extracted silver and copper for the imperial treasury. Sardis, that wealthy capital of Lydia, where Croesus had once counted his legendary golden treasures, now served as a Western administrative center, where Persian governors maintained the delicate balance between imperial control and local autonomy. The royal road that connected Sardis to Susa created a corridor of communication that transformed isolated mountain communities into integral components of a vast imperial network. Villages that had previously existed in relative isolation now found themselves hosting way stations where imperial messengers changed horses and local inhabitants glimpsed the cosmopolitan diversity of the empire through the faces of travelers from distant provinces. The Aegean coast, where Greek cities perched on hills overlooking harbors filled with trading vessels, represented the western frontier of Persian ambition. Here, the empire encountered not scattered tribes or ancient kingdoms, but a different model of political organization entirely: the city-state, with its fierce traditions of local autonomy and civic participation. The olive groves that carpeted hillsides around cities like Ephesus and Miletus had witnessed the development of philosophy and mathematics, their silver-green leaves rustling with intellectual currents that would eventually challenge Persian imperial ideology. Yet for now, these cities acknowledged Persian overlordship while maintaining their essential Greek character, their agoras continuing to buzz with debate and commerce, while Persian tribute flowed eastward along established trade routes. Islands scattered across the Aegean Sea, like stepping stones toward mainland Greece, presented their own administrative challenges to Persian rule, each rocky outcrop maintaining distinct customs shaped by isolation and maritime traditions. The wine produced on volcanic slopes of islands like Lesbos and Chios found eager markets in Persian courts, while island artisans crafted pottery and metalwork that reflected the cultural fusion occurring throughout the empire. Fishing boats that had worked these waters since Bronze Age times continued their seasonal migrations, But now their catches fed not only local populations, but also Persian garrisons stationed on strategic islands that controlled sea routes between Asia and Europe. The sheer geographical scope of this imperial achievement becomes even more remarkable when considered in terms of the natural barriers that Persian administration successfully overcame. Mountain ranges that had previously formed impermeable boundaries between peoples now served as mere landscape features, crossed by roads and communication networks. Deserts that had isolated communities for centuries became navigable through way stations and water management systems that made long-distance travel possible for merchants and officials alike. Rivers that had once formed boundaries between hostile kingdoms now flowed through unified territories where trade could flourish without the constant threat of warfare disrupting commercial relationships. The empire's vastness created temporal as well as spatial complexity, with news from the Indian provinces taking weeks or months to reach the western satrapies, while seasonal variations meant that different regions experienced completely different climatic conditions simultaneously. While monsoon rains drenched the eastern territories, Mediterranean regions might be experiencing their dry season, creating agricultural and economic rhythms that required sophisticated coordination to manage effectively. The Persian administrative system accommodated these variations through flexible tribute collection schedules and regional adaptations that recognized local conditions while maintaining overall imperial cohesion. This geographical immensity fostered cultural exchanges on a scale never before witnessed in human history, as Persian roads carried not only official messages and military supplies, but also ideas, artistic styles, religious practices, and technological innovations across vast distances. The empire became a conduit for the cross-pollination of civilizations, with Indian mathematical concepts traveling westward while Greek philosophical ideas moved eastward, all facilitated by the unprecedented connectivity that Persian infrastructure made possible. In this vast imperial laboratory, the foundations were being laid for cultural synthesis that would influence human development long after the Persian Empire itself had passed into history. Its geographical legacy measured not merely in miles or territories conquered, but in the enduring connections forged between distant lands and diverse peoples. In the year 530 BCE, as autumn painted the steppes in shades of gold and amber, Cyrus the Great embarked upon what would become his final campaign. The vast empire he had forged stretched from the Mediterranean shores to the Hindu Kush, yet beyond its northeastern borders lay the unconquered lands of the Masagatai, a nomadic people whose queen, Tomyris, ruled with the fierce independence of those who knew no master. The aging emperor, now in his 70th year, felt the pull of one last horizon, one final triumph to crown a lifetime of unprecedented conquest. The morning mist clung to the Araxes River as Cyrus's armies crossed into Masagatai territory. His soldiers moved with the practiced efficiency of men who had marched across continents, their bronze armor catching the pale sunlight that filtered through the autumn haze. The sound of 10,000 footsteps created a rhythm that had echoed across the ancient world for decades, a drumbeat of empire that had never known defeat. Yet in this distant land, where the wind carried the scent of wild herbs, and the cry of eagles soared above endless grasslands, the great wheel of fate began its inexorable turn. The battle that followed would be remembered not for its tactics or its scale, but for the profound silence that settled over the Persian camp when news of the emperor's death reached his commanders. Cyrus the Great, the shepherd who had become a king, the king who had become an emperor, the man who had transformed the very notion of how the world might be governed, lay still beneath the vast sky he had sought to claim. The Masagatai had fought with the desperate courage of those defending their ancestral lands, and in that struggle, the greatest conqueror the world had yet known found his final rest. As word of Cyrus's death spread across the empire, it travelled along the very roads he had built, carried by the messengers who had once brought news of his victories. In Babylon, the priests who had welcomed him as a liberator offered prayers in languages he had protected. In Jerusalem, the Jewish elders who had returned from exile through his decree spoke his name with reverence. From the Greek cities of Asia Minor to the trading posts along the Silk Road, From the palaces of Sardis to the temples of Memphis, the empire that Cyrus had created began to grapple with the reality of his absence. Yet, even in death, the structures he had established continued to function with remarkable stability. The satrapies he had created, each governed by trusted administrators who understood both local customs and imperial requirements, maintained order across the vast territories. The tolerance he had shown toward diverse peoples and their beliefs had created bonds of loyalty that transcended the presence of any single ruler. The administrative systems he had put in place, the roads he had built, the postal services he had established, all continued to serve the empire's needs, as if guided by his invisible hand. His son Cambyses assumed the throne with a legitimacy that few questioned, inheriting not merely territories, but a functioning system of governance that had never before existed at such a scale. The Persian nobility, trained in Cyrus's methods and imbued with his vision of just rule, provided continuity that allowed the empire to weather the transition from its founder to his successor. The very institutions Cyrus had created proved more durable than bronze, more lasting than stone, forming the foundation upon which subsequent Persian rulers would build for centuries to come. In the royal tombs of Pasargadae, craftsmen began work on a monument that would embody the simplicity and dignity that had characterized Cyrus's reign. Unlike the elaborate burial chambers of earlier monarchs, his final resting place would be austere, elegant, rising from the Persian plain like a testament to the humility he had maintained even at the height of his power. The limestone blocks, fitted together with precision that spoke of reverence rather than ostentation, would shelter his remains for millennia, weathering the rise and fall of dynasties yet unborn. The influence of Cyrus's example extended far beyond the borders of his empire. The principles he had established, the integration of diverse peoples under a single administrative framework, the respect for local customs within an imperial system, would be studied and emulated by rulers across continents and through centuries. Alexander of Macedon, conquering the very empire Cyrus had built, would adopt many of his methods. Roman emperors would look to Persian administrative models when governing their own vast territories. The very concept of empire as something more than mere conquest, as a system that could bring prosperity and stability to diverse peoples, bore the indelible mark of Cyrus's innovation. His treatment of conquered peoples, revolutionary in its clemency and wisdom, established precedents that would echo through history. The cylinder bearing his decrees, buried in the foundations of Babylon's temples, would one day be called the first charter of human rights, its principles of religious tolerance and cultural respect, anticipating ideas that would not be formally articulated for over 2 millennia. The Jewish communities he had restored, the Babylonian customs he had preserved, the Greek traditions he had protected, all testified to a vision of rulership that transcended the simple accumulation of power. The Persian language, elevated during his reign from a regional dialect to the lingua franca of administration across his empire, would carry his legacy into distant futures. Diplomatic correspondence conducted in Persian would flow between courts separated by thousands of miles. Trade agreements written in his tongue would facilitate commerce along routes that connected the Mediterranean to the Indus Valley. The cultural synthesis he had fostered, the blending of traditions from across the known world, would create artistic and intellectual achievements that would inspire civilizations yet unborn. As generations passed, the memory of Cyrus the Great would acquire an almost mythical quality. Stories of his wisdom and justice would be told in languages he had never heard, in lands he had never seen. The principles he had embodied, the balance between strength and mercy, between imperial ambition and local autonomy, would become ideals toward which later rulers would aspire. Even his enemies, writing their histories centuries later, would speak of him with grudging admiration, recognizing in his methods something approaching greatness. The empire he had created would endure for over 2 centuries, outlasting the Greek city-states that had once seemed the pinnacle of civilization, surviving longer than the kingdoms of Egypt that had already been ancient when Cyrus was born. The administrative genius he had displayed, the cultural synthesis he had achieved, the geographic scope of his accomplishment, would establish Persia as a civilizational force that would shape the ancient world long after the last of his dynasty had fallen. In the quiet of evening, when the last light fades from the ruins of Persepolis and shadows gather around the tomb at Pasargadae, the legacy of Cyrus the Great seems almost tangible in the Persian air. The wind that moves through the ancient stones carries with it the memory of a vision that transformed the world, a dream of empire that was as much about justice as conquest, as much about preservation as expansion. The shepherd boy, who became the king of kings, rests still in his simple tomb, while the ideas he championed continue their eternal journey through the corridors of time, whispering their quiet wisdom to any